Chapter 11, Year 5, Part 1. The incantation for the bone-shattering curse is Fracta Ossem. Naturally, one has to concentrate on the target in order to determine which bone in particular is... Harry shook his head, suddenly disoriented, and went back to read the sentence again. The incantation for the bone-shattering curse... He blinked. Just a moment ago the book had been fascinating, but now the spells seemed dull and impossible to master. The incantation... Harry felt a chill run down his spine. Thoughts crowded his head, heavy, unpleasant thoughts, ones that persistently manifested during his nightmares. What was he doing this for? He was at Privet Drive and couldn't practice magic anyway. Even if he could, what chance did he have against Voldemort, who... Suddenly the silence of his room was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. It was coming from downstairs, and Harry heard noise, shuffling and shouting, and something crashing. He jumped up from his bed, book falling aside, and grabbed his wand. He wished he had his invisibility cloak to keep him hidden from possible intruders, but he had the sinking feeling that he already knew who the intruders were, although he couldn't quite believe it. He stepped out onto the landing outside his room, keeping to the shadows, and then, through the open front door, he saw them. Dementors. 2 Dementors right outside the Dursley home. A tall, dark form glided after Dudley on the lawn, and Dudley collapsed mid-run, whimpering and clutching his head. Aunt Petunia was running outside with a scream, Uncle Vernon hot on her heels, and Harry hadn't noticed how he ended up on the bottom of the stairs, shouting, "Expecto Patronum!" Shapeless white mist emerged from Harry's wand as a Dementor glided towards him, completely incongruous with the neat lawn in front of the Dursleys' house. It was almost pitch black outside, too dark for 10 o'clock at night, but Harry could dimly see Aunt Petunia tugging Dudley up and Uncle Vernon trying to land wild blows. Expecto Patronum! More of that wispy vapour. Harry could no longer discern what was happening outside. A Dementor was blocking the doorway. Harry heard screams, but he wasn't sure whether they were coming from the Dursleys or from inside his memories. Images swam before his eyes. Bertha Jorkins falling dead to the ground. Voldemort staring at him in triumphant malice, the killing curse speeding towards him. Harry gripped his wand tightly enough to hurt, and made himself think of what happened in that memory next. His mother's beautiful face, his father's smile, their loving words. "Expecto Patronum!" A bright white stag erupted from Harry's wand. It rammed straight into the Dementor at the threshold, colliding with it in a blur of luminescent greyish-white. With a screech so high-pitched Harry almost thought he'd imagined it, the Dementor floated onto the lawn. The impenetrable haze of misery lifted from over Harry, and the distant screaming in his mind stopped entirely, and he found himself able to draw a deep breath again. Harry sagged against the doorframe, clutching his wand in a sweaty fist. He saw his Patronus dash after the Dementors and lifted his eyes. Aunt Petunia was already falling away from a fleeing Dementor's grasp. Dudley was wailing in fear, flesh trembling like a mound of jelly, and Uncle Vernon crawled on the ground and swung blindly with his fists as another Dementor glided past him in retreat. Looking at them from his spot by the door, Harry wondered if this was what he wanted. For all wrongs done, did the Dursleys really deserve saving? How often had he dreamed of this, of seeing the Dursleys brought low and punished for their treatment of him. Here they were now, all 3 of them, broken, powerless. They'd been Harry's tormentors for so long, but Harry held all the power right now. If he'd wanted, he could have left the Dursleys to the Dementors' mercy, and they wouldn't have been able to do anything. Right now they had no power over themselves, let alone Harry. They'd needed Harry to protect them because they were Muggles. They were weak and devoid of magic. In a bright flash of revelation, Harry understood why his relatives had always been so scared of wizards. He told himself that he didn't hate all Muggles, so it wasn't wrong of him to revel in the inferiority of these particular ones. While he stood, still holding on to the doorframe, his Patronus had been chasing the Dementors further down the street. The foul creature's departure dispelled the veil of cold and darkness over Privet Drive, and Harry found it easier to breathe, though his heart was still beating erratically. Dementors on Privet Drive. It boggled the mind. The Patronus turned to look at Harry from where it stopped on the street corner, gave a small deferential nod, and then gradually dissipated in the night's air. Harry was left with twilight, tingling nerves, and the Dursley family strewn across the lawn. For a moment he stood still, gathering his bearings. Then, with slow, measured steps, he approached his relatives. Uncle Vernon was kneeling in front of Aunt Petunia's prone body, blocking it from Harry's view. Uncle Vernon's fists were clenching and unclenching, and Harry could not see his face, but he assumed that the man was okay, since he seemed to be moving of his own volition. A bit to the side, Dudley stood on all fours, vomiting and coughing and sputtering, and Harry didn't spare him more than a fleeting glance. He stepped forward. Aunt Petunia lay sprawled, limbs at odd angles. She was pale as a wraith, and she didn't move, and her eyes were wide and empty, and Harry felt cold wash over him as he gazed down at her. She looked. "Aunt Petunia?" he called, swallowing. No response. Harry threw a glance at Uncle Vernon, but the man seemed to be frozen in place. Harry lowered himself onto the grass, his first and irrational instinct to check his aunt's pulse. It was clear that she was alive. She was blinking. But how did one probe for the presence of a soul inside a body? "Aunt Petunia, if you hear me, please blink twice," Harry said, feeling completely out of his depth. No response once again. Just those steady, rhythmic blinks. Harry clenched his jaw. He didn't have a fucking clue what to do, but it was clear that nobody else present did either, and something would have to be done. "Carry her into the house," Harry told Uncle Vernon, voice brooking no argument. Though clearly not himself at the moment, Uncle Vernon remained capable of following simple orders. Scooping up his wife, he wobbled towards the front door. Harry turned to Dudley. "Get inside," he commanded. Harry entered the house behind Dudley. The boy staggered off to the living room after his father, but Harry took a few moments to do a final check outside and lock the door. Then he walked into the living room after them both. Aunt Petunia was on the sofa, face still deathly pale and eyes vacant. Dudley was kneeling on the floor next to her, rivulets of tears running down his fat cheeks, and pleaded with her to wake up. Uncle Vernon stood to the side. His eyes were glued to his wife, as if his entire existence hinged on watching her and waiting for her to rouse. Aunt Petunia did not comfort her crying son. She did not try to soothe her husband's fear. She just lay there. "She's not waking up," Dudley sobbed into the silence. "Why won't she wake up?" Harry thought dimly that he was not reacting to this as he should. He'd spent some of the Dementor attack revelling in the feeling of power over his relatives. He probably ought to feel guilty about it now, but he didn't. He just felt hollow, numb with shock. His aunt had seemingly lost her soul, and Harry knew intellectually that it was horrible and nauseating and even potentially traumatizing, but he couldn't feel it. He wasn't taking it in. As if a void had opened somewhere in his chest and sucked all feeling away. "She's awake, but she's not," Dudley was mumbling, rocking back and forth. Not. Just then, Harry saw a blur out of the corner of his eye. He whirled instinctively, wand brought up, but it was only an owl that swooped down towards him and dropped the letter that it was carrying by his feet. Not waiting for a reply, the bird flew off again with a low hoot. It was this sound that startled Uncle Vernon into awareness. Just as Harry bent down to pick up the letter, noting the ministry's seal on it, the man spun around. "You!" he roared, face livid. "It's all your fault! What did you do?" Uncle Vernon advanced on Harry, fists raised, and Harry fought to keep his face calm as he levelled his wand at him. "Don't," he advised. "You know I can curse you."
going to kill me, boy, like you killed your aunt?" Uncle Vernon shouted, stepping closer still.
"She's not dead," Harry said quietly.
"Then what is she?"
Another owl flew into the room, soaring over Uncle Vernon's head to drop its letter on Harry, who took it automatically.
"I will not stand for this. I won't have it. I will kill you with my bare hands."
Uncle Vernon lunged at Harry, and Harry ducked from under his reach. "Don't be stupid. This isn't the time." But Vernon caught him by his shirt and swung his fist. Harry twisted in his uncle's grasp and kicked the man's knee as hard as he could, dodging the blow aimed at his head. Vernon collapsed on the floor with a scream, and Harry leaned against the wall, letting out a breath. He raised his eyes to see whether Dudley would pose any danger to him now. But Dudley didn't seem to understand what was happening. He was still trying to wake his mother. "Why were the Dementors here?" Harry asked out loud, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He felt that if he knew this part of the puzzle, he could move on to analyzing the situation. But as it was, he couldn't get past Dementors on the Dursleys' front lawn. It just shouldn't be possible. Besides, why hadn't his guards acted on the threat? It was all very hush-hush, and Harry only knew about the guards thanks to the twins. He'd been worried that it was Voldemort spying on him before they'd let him know. His guards had resisted all attempts at communication when Harry had tried to initiate contact earlier this summer, and he understood the need for secrecy, but this went above and beyond. What was the point of having a secret guard if it did not do anything? Had they somehow missed the Dementors' arrival? Why in 7 hells had the Dementors even turned up in Little Winging? "Dudley, Uncle Vernon, can you tell me anything about where the Dementors came from?" Harry had been upstairs, after all, and missed the start of the attack. Dudley looked at Harry blearily. "The creatures that were here," Harry clarified. "Couldn't you see them?"
"No, oh," Dudley hiccuped. "I felt something following me. There was something horrible on the street, and I ran home, but it was there, and I was so weak, and I saw—" He gulped. "And then Mom was there, and then Dad ran out, and then—"
"Followed you?" Harry repeated. So Dementors had appeared in Little Winging out of the blue and followed Dudley to Harry Potter's home. Weren't they meant to be guarding Azkaban somewhere in the North Sea?
"Don't you dare blame this on Dudley!"
Vernon snarled, raising his head from the floor. "I'm not blaming it on Dudley," Harry said curtly. "I'm just trying to think."
"What's there to think about? It's all your fault. If not for you—"
There was a knock on the front door. "It's Remus Lupin and Aleister Moody," Lupin's voice said from the other side of the door when Harry went to check. "Please let us in." Harry frowned. "Prove it." "I'm sorry?" "Prove that it's you, or I'm not opening the door."
"Cheeky bugger," Moody grumbled.
"Very well, Potter. I saw you after I was released from St. Mungo's, and gave you back the Marauder's map. And I told you at the end of your 3rd year that your father had been a stag animagus, and I helped you produce your stag Patronus. Anyone could know both these things." "Harry," Lupin sounded somewhat exasperated. "Don't you have a letter from Dumbledore saying that we would be coming to check up on you?" Harry looked down at the unopened letters in his hand and unfolded the one without the ministry seal. "Fine," he said after skimming it. "Come in." Lupin entered with a friendly smile on his face, and Moody followed, his magical eyes scanning the surroundings. It had evidently been replaced since Harry had last seen him. "What happened here?" Moody asked brusquely, walking right towards the living room. "Dumbledore says you've cast the Patronus charm, but you better have a good reason, because the Ministry's greedy for anything to charge you with—" "They can't charge me after the first offence," Harry said. "At least they shouldn't be able to, by their own laws." Harry withdrew the ministry letter and broke the seal. "And is it your first?" Moody ascertained. "Yes," Harry said, not looking up from his letter. "Yes, first offence, paragraph C, magic in front of muggles, my first warning," he said, folding the letter again. "Besides which, There were 2 Dementors attacking me and my relatives. Moody harumphed. Dementors here? Lupin wondered. That's... He didn't have time to finish the sentence, because Harry's uncle caught sight of them as they stepped into the living room. Vernon had apparently managed to pick himself up from the floor, although he was heavily favouring his uninjured leg as he stood awkwardly by the sofa, glowering at the intruders. Dudley remained where he'd been, only throwing a fearful glance at the new arrivals.
"You!"
Vernon snarled, pointing a fat finger at the wizards.
"More of you invading my house!"
If Lupin and Moody were fazed by this greeting, they did not show it. "I'm sorry, but—" Lupin began.
"You'd better be here to take the brat away, because I'm not having him in my house any longer."
Moody glared at Vernon. Vernon was bigger, but Moody was a hell of a lot more intimidating, and Vernon paled as the ex-aura barked, rolling his magical eye in its socket. "Calm down and stop this racket! What seems to be the problem?" "I think my aunt has been kissed by a Dementor," Harry said quietly. Lupin's face strained out of colour. Moody's eyes, both normal and magical, focused on Aunt Petunia's body. The wizards walked over to check the veracity of Harry's claim, ignoring Vernon's protests. "Our condolences," Lupin muttered in the end, stepping aside.
"Fucking hell,"
Moody said at the same time. "We have to tell Dumbledore," Lupin added, looking like he agreed with Moody's sentiment. "He should come or send someone along. The wards—" "Are they still active?" Harry asked. "Where? They even active if the Dementors got here." "Could the Dementors enter the house itself?" Lupin inquired. Harry thought back to the events earlier that evening. "No," he said after a moment. "That is, I'm not sure whether the Dementor didn't enter because it didn't have time, or because it couldn't, but it came pretty close anyway." Over the summer, Harry had done some thinking about the blood wards he'd found out about last year, and he'd figured they were the answer to something that had had him wondering for a while now. There had to be a reason why the boy who lived had never had a worshipper come gawk at his house, or an assassin make way to his home, or a politician try to draw him into the wizarding world. He never even got fan mail, which one might have expected with him being so famous, nor any other tokens of his celebrity. Harry's address was known and openly available to Hogwarts and to the Ministry, and yet he'd always been left alone, before and after he'd started studying at Hogwarts. The wizarding world did not seem able to reach him at Privet Drive, as if the house was under a notice-me-not charm, unless they were expressly reminded to look for Harry there. That crazy house-elf a few years ago, and the Dementors today, were exceptions in this regard, but they were magical creatures rather than humans. Perhaps the wards did not apply to them in the same manner. The Dementor attack also brought up the question of whether Voldemort, having Harry's blood in his veins, had weakened the protection somehow, reducing the effectiveness of the wards. With Aunt Petunia having been kissed, Harry couldn't even begin to predict what would happen to the wards now. "Your aunt is not dead," Lupin said carefully, "so maybe the wards will keep. However, I'm not sure of the details. I think it would be best not to risk it. I'll go send Dumbledore a message."
"That's right! Leave and take the brat with you!"
Vernon shouted as Lupin exited the room.
"He's cursed us all! You and your magic! It didn't do much for the brat's parents, and now Petunia is... And I don't care if all of you die, but I'm not letting you harm Dudley."
"Calm the fuck down," Moody growled, cutting Vernon off. "Nobody's planning to harm your son. Nobody wished your wife any harm either. Potter won't be able to stay here anyway, I reckon, and we'll take him with us when we go. But if he has to come back, you'll take him back. Get it, Dursley?" Dudley quivered at Moody's tone, and hid himself behind an armchair. Vernon, for his part, flushed puce, and looked about to say something unpleasant back, but then caught the expression on Moody's face, and paled again. He gave a terse nod. "Excellent," Moody said. "Potter, go and collect your stuff." Harry's packing was rushed. He threw things haphazardly into his suitcase, favouring speed over order. He had to leave several items of clothing behind to fit all his books in, but that was about the only trouble he had. He led Hedwig out, telling her to find him at his destination, and thanks to the twins, he had a pretty good idea of what it would be. Over the last month, Harry had corresponded with his friends, Hedwig making tireless rounds all over Britain, but only the twins had proved truly informative. They had sent him coded letters, disguising important information as nonsense. This way, Harry had learnt of Dumbledore's secret organisation that was guarding him at Privet Drive this summer. Harry also knew the organisation was dedicated to fighting Voldemort. He knew the twins were living at the headquarters. He knew Sirius Black owned the house. It was difficult to glean anything more concrete from Fred and George's letters. However, since they didn't say anything... It was difficult to glean anything more concrete from Fred and George's letters, however, since they didn't say anything outright. Main question, the place for crocodiles. Is it really a restaurant? Capital punishment turns black their souls. Own up to house rivalry, infidel. Harry felt little desire to reacquaint himself with Black, but he was curious to have a look at the inner workings of Dumbledore's organisation. Living at its headquarters could also provide Harry with an opportunity to learn more about what Voldemort was up to. As of now, he knew next to nothing, as the Daily Prophet had been steadily denying Voldemort's return, and painting Harry as a delusional attention-seeker in cahoots with Dumbledore. This told Harry zero about Voldemort's movements, though he did gain an understanding of the current political climate. Cedric had told him that not everyone believed ministry propaganda, not even in the wizarding government itself. Some idiots are of course going to fall for the official word, but the scandal at the third task is too juicy to pass up. Have you read Skeeter's latest? Even she has trouble deciding whom to back. These days, Rita Skeeter's articles were indeed an exercise in careful balancing. Instead of supporting or openly defying the ministry line, she went with stirring up the masses by feeding them all kinds of conspiracy theories. Taken together, her writings gave the impression that nobody was completely in the right, Harry or the ministry, and that Rita alone could uncover the shocking truth. This might or might not be something Harry could exploit in future, but he would take no drastic steps until he got the lay of the land. "All packed?" Moody said, once Harry returned to the living room to find Lupin there too. "Fine, then let's go." Harry nodded at his relatives. "Bye," he said, for lack of anything better. Dudley had still not emerged from behind the armchair. Vernon only muttered something under his breath. Whatever it was, Harry doubted it was complimentary. Neither Lupin nor Moody could mistake the scene for a stoic goodbye, but Lupin did not remark on it, even though he looked disturbed, and Moody chose to ignore the matter altogether. Harry avoided looking at Aunt Petunia's prone body on the couch as he walked out of the door. The paper Moody thrust at Harry upon their arrival to a dark square somewhere in London told him that Dumbledore's secret group was called the Order of the Phoenix, and that its headquarters were located at number 12 Grimmauld Place. The latter turned out to be a dingy old house with a hysterical portrait and a staircase decorated with severed house-elf heads. Harry had known the Blacks had been tug wizards, but the cheerfulness of their dwelling exceeded even his expectations. A red-headed woman came out of a door further down the dim hallway to greet Harry, Moody, and Lupin when they entered the house. She seemed somehow familiar, and after a moment Harry recognized her as the Weasley matriarch. "Oh, good evening," she whispered, making an abortive movement towards Harry. "Harry Potter, well, it's good to see you again, of course, dear. Come through to the kitchen. We weren't expecting you. Has anything happened, Remus?" There were only 3 people in the kitchen. Mr. Weasley, a young man who looked like he was a Weasley too, and, of course, Sirius Black. He looked much healthier than the last time Harry had seen him. Gone were the deranged expression, the dirty hair, the painful gauntness. Evidently he'd at least somewhat recovered from his stay in prison. Good for him. Everyone stood up when they saw Harry enter, Mr. Weasley giving an exclamation of surprise. "Harry Potter!" he said unnecessarily. "Well, good evening. What brings you here? Is everything all right?" "Not everything," Moody said, while Harry shook Mr. Weasley's hand. "There's been a bit of a clusterfuck with Potter's relatives." "Alistair, really?" Mrs. Weasley exclaimed. Moody scowled. "Potter's aunt has been kissed by a Dementor." There were gasps all around. "What was a Dementor doing here?" So the Patronus... Has Dumbledore been notified? What I want to know, Lupin said firmly, is who was meant to be on guard duty tonight. Harry very much wanted to know that too, as well as the reason why they had abandoned their post. It was Dung Fletcher, I think, the unknown Weasley said. I remember him mentioning it. Dumbledore will rip him a new one, Moody said with relish. It's a bit awkward with us not being introduced, the young Weasley said, turning to Harry. I'm Bill. Nice to meet you, and blimey, I'm sorry about your aunt. I can't imagine how horrible it must be. Thank you, Harry said, but I'd rather not talk about it. Or think about it, if he could help it. The numbness was abating, and instead horrified awareness washed over Harry each time his thoughts strayed to his aunt's slackened face.
She's awake, but she's not. Not!
Harry forcibly redirected his thoughts, grappling for any other discussion topic. Are Fred and George around? He asked. Oh, yes, they're just upstairs, Bill answered, looking relieved at the change of subject. It was all boring talk down here. Nothing was exploding or setting itself on fire, you know. Yeah, Harry nodded. Ron's here too, Bill added, and Ginny. It was nice of Sirius to let us stay while we were figuring out how to add security to the burrow. Our home, he clarified, seeing Harry's incomprehension. There was still a month until Hogwarts. A whole month in close proximity to Ron Weasley. Harry thought his joy might just suffocate him. And then, naturally, Lupin drew Harry aside from the group in order to formally introduce him to Sirius Black. Nice to meet you, Harry said politely, wishing he could strangle Lupin. Harry was not ready to deal with this right now. Black gave him a winning grin, but it was belied by the uncertainty in his grey eyes. Good to properly meet you too, finally. Lupin looked between them, smiling. I leave you to it then. With that, the goddamn werewolf retreated, presumably giving Harry and Black space for a tearful reunion. There was a moment's silence. Then, It's good to see you again, Harry. Last time, everything went wrong when I saw you last, Black said, lips twisting into a shallow approximation of a smile. I just spent 12 years in Azkaban. It wasn't a good time for me to be meeting my godson. So, can we try to start over? Black was giving Harry a look that was almost desperate in its intensity, and Harry held back an urge to snap at him to stop. What did the man want? Yeah, no worries, Harry would turn a new leaf just like that, because that's how emotions worked with people. From here on out, they'd be a happy family and do whatever it was that happy families did. Sure, Harry said. We can start over. He wasn't certain how sincere that came out, so he went on. Thank you for letting me stay at your house. Sirius Black winced. There's no need to thank me. You're my godson, Harry. Of course you're welcome to stay. Because family ties made everything okay, as the Dursleys had amply demonstrated. Right, Harry said, forcing the memory of his aunt's vacant eyes out of his mind. Actually, if it turns out that you can't go back to your Muggle relatives, you're welcome to stay with me, Black offered. Harry must have glanced at him very strangely, because he gave an awkward shrug. Well, if you wanted, of course. I mean, during the holidays and stuff. You'll need a place to stay, right? Why would you do that? Harry asked, incredulous. I mean, no offence, but you've just met me. Black shook his head. You're... Hell, Harry, I haven't just met you. I mean, you don't remember me, but... Plain pain flashed in Black's expression, but it was gone as fast as it came. The next moment he was smiling crookedly. You've grown up, of course, but you're still my godson, and my best friend's son. That hasn't changed. Just about everything else had, though. Voldemort was back, which meant that Harry would need all the help he could get to obtain information about his movements. If Black was half as emotionally invested as he pretended to be, he might assist in Harry's quest to discover as much as he could about the looming war while at the Order's headquarters. Experience with adults told Harry that the Order would not be willing to share information with him. At least, adults' track record so far had been to alert Harry of things he might need to know at the last possible minute. Those hadn't been minor omissions either. He'd been left in the dark in third year about the whole Sirius Black business until after it was over. Lupin had hidden his friendship with Harry's dad, and Dumbledore beat all by concealing facts about the prophecy. Most recently the Order, or Dumbledore, whichever, chose to keep mum about Harry's guard at Privet Drive, even though once again the issue concerned him directly. All of the above made Harry feel that he could do with an ally on Order territory, someone willing to tell him more than others. Perhaps it was wrong of him to think in those terms, to strategize about his behavior at the Order's headquarters as if he was on hostile ground. But quite honestly, he did not feel fully comfortable here. There was the fact that he'd had unpleasant experiences with some of the members, namely Dumbledore, Lupin, Black, and the younger Weasleys. And also, he knew that all Order members were Dumbledore's people. While they were on the same anti-Voldemort side, Harry did not count himself as a Dumbledore loyalist. And Harry didn't give a flying fuck about their opinions on what he should know. He wanted to find out as much as he could, and he would do it, by hook or crook. Harry swallowed his tiredness and tried to hide the wave of dislike he felt at the mere sight of Black's face. "Yes," he said, "I'd forgotten that you must have known me when I was really small. You have to tell me about it sometime." Like Harry had expected, the Order was not eager to include him in their affairs, even despite Black's support. Matters came to a head the very second night Harry was at the headquarters. The Order was planning to have a meeting after dinner, and Harry lingered stubbornly behind. "You're not yet of age, Harry," Mr. Weasley said. "Fred and George aren't allowed into the Order either." "I'm not asking to join the Order," Harry countered politely. "I just think that, considering past events, I should be given access to some information." "I agree," Sirius Black said promptly. "Harry is just as involved in this war as we are." Mrs. Weasley glared at him. "It is the job of responsible adults to make sure he is not as involved," she said. "He is only 15. And yet he'd seen more of Voldemort than she ever had. Funny how that worked. "With all due respect, Mrs. Weasley, if my godfather believes I have a right to information, I do not see who else can have a say in the matter. Professor Dumbledore is not my legal guardian."
"Very true, my boy," Dumbledore's jovial voice said from the kitchen's doorway. "However, I happen to lead this organization, and as such I have authority over potential disclosure of information to outsiders."
Harry turned to face the headmaster. Several people entered the room together with Dumbledore. Among them were Lupin, a young woman with bubblegum pink hair, a tall, dark-skinned man, and a man in a ridiculous top hat. All of them stared in interest between Harry and Dumbledore, as did the occupants of the kitchen. Harry inclined his head. "Of course, Headmaster. However, I recall you promising that you would not withhold information from me any longer," he said calmly. "Surely you don't mean to break your word now?" They both knew that Dumbledore hadn't truly meant his promise to keep Harry in the loop, but the other people in the room didn't, and Harry would like to see the headmaster weasel out of this one without losing face. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled merrily.
"Ah, the curiosity of youth," Dumbledore said, evidently deciding to play the age card. "By all means, Harry, I do not mean to deprive you of information altogether, but I must ask you to be realistic in your desires. They are matters of security that cannot be overlooked."
"Just as long as I can trust your judgment, Headmaster," Harry smiled sweetly. "I guess you stationing a guard around my house without letting me know was the result of some grave miscommunication." And so began the meeting that opened the Order's eyes to a few things about the boy who lived. Harry quickly realized that, like everyone else, the Order had their ideas of what the boy who lived should be like, and Harry was very blatantly not it. He contemplated trying to be it, once he saw how deeply the divide ran, but there were certain things that he could not conceal, and the dynamics of his relationship with Dumbledore were one of them. Harry wasn't going to defer to Dumbledore on everything just because they had an audience, and it couldn't be helped that his and Dumbledore's interactions had shocked quite a few people, the elder Weasleys among them. Snape's arrival caused yet another stir. The man stormed into the room, all billowing cloak and fearsome scowl, and his appearance took Harry by surprise, although he maintained an impassive face.
"Ah, Severus," Dumbledore said, beaming. "As you see, one of your students has joined us tonight."
The slight non sequitur was obviously meant to warn Snape against saying too much in Harry's presence, but then Dumbledore continued in the spirit of sharing.
"You might be wondering, Harry, Professor Snape serves in the very important role of a spy for the Order."
Later Harry realized that this was the point when he could have improved the Order's earlier impression of him. He should have bulged his eyes out in amazement, or let out a shriek, or, well, done something to reflect his feelings. However, he merely nodded, pretending not to be fazed by the news as he usually would, and was startled by Black's disbelieving.
"Is that all? That's all the reaction you're going to give?"
Harry looked at him blankly. The man's face reflected a mix between incredulity and indignation.
"Are you going to trust Snape just like that?"
Black continued, ignoring Dumbledore's frown and Snape's withering glare.
Are you even—"
At loss for how to respond, Harry glanced at Professor Snape. The man was surveying Black with great derision.
"You'll do well to disregard Black's drivel, Potter. His stability was questionable before Azkaban, but after—" "Shut up, you Death Eater, and don't you talk to Harry as if you have a right to tell him what to do." "You will find that I do have that right, Black. I am Potter's head of house, Slytherin, in case it slipped your mind."
Harry took in Black's slight wince and Snape's scowl, and he felt that there was a long story here, and that he didn't want to know, and certainly didn't want to get dragged into the middle of it.
"Gentlemen," Dumbledore said sharply, "do compose yourselves."
And so they did, but the matter had certainly not been put to rest. In the following days, Black tried to reassure Harry that he didn't really mind that Harry was a Slytherin. It was just that Harry shouldn't listen to anything Snape had to say, ever, because Snape hated Harry's dad and would probably strangle Harry should they meet in a dark alley with no witnesses. Snape, for his part, informed Harry that Black had been capable of murder at 16, and going by what had happened to Pettigrew, was still capable of it, and Harry should be wary of the man for more reasons than the obvious Azkaban-induced madness. All in all, both adults exhibited the maturity of house elves on fire whiskey doping, and Harry didn't even care to know what they were trying to prove. The incident with Snape and Black had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the Order either, and Harry caught wisps of conversations. How no 15-year-old should have a face that unreadable, how it was creepy the way Harry controlled his emotions, and what had been done to this child anyway to make him this closed off. Harry resented being called a child, and the implication that something had been done to him, but of course he didn't let his feelings show because, well, whatever they said, he'd learned that showcasing his emotions would get him nowhere. On the bright side, some people seemed to find him intriguing. "You're a lot more interesting than I thought you would be," the pink-haired witch had declared, eyes sparkling mischievously. "Name's Tonks, if you didn't catch it earlier. Pleased to meet you." Harry had been pleased to meet her too, since she proved to be one of the more likeable people he'd encountered at the Order headquarters, and worth her weight in entertainment value besides. More generally, that first Order meeting had set the tone for all to come. The Order, whatever their feelings towards Harry, started taking him more seriously, since he'd firmly set himself apart from the other kids, and procured Dumbledore's blessing to attend some meetings. He wasn't allowed in on everything, but what the Order didn't tell him he could wheedle out of Black. Not that anything particularly exciting was happening. Both Dumbledore and Voldemort were busy trying to recruit allies, their interests clashing as far as humans, werewolves, and giants were concerned. The Order was also worried that Voldemort would lure the Dementors onto his side, but that had not happened yet, which meant either that the attack on Harry this summer must have been authorized by someone at the Ministry, or that some rogue Dementors had deserted Azkaban after all. Harry thought the latter option was actually preferable. A lot of Voldemort's and Dumbledore's plans revolved around the prophecy. Apparently, after Harry had blithely survived his second killing curse, Voldemort got seriously worried about the prophecy, assuming that the second part, one he did not know, explained Harry's strange immunity. Therefore, along with covertly recruiting allies, Voldemort threw significant effort into infiltrating the Department of Mysteries, intending to steal the prophecy and hear it in full. Thanks to Snape, the Order knew of these plans and used them to further their own main goal, namely getting the Ministry to accept Voldemort's return. The Order kept a guard around the Department of Mysteries, waiting for the Death Eaters of Voldemort to show up. Once they did, the Order would call for backup, stage a great ruckus, and then the ensuing fight would reveal to the Ministry with incontrovertible proof that Voldemort was indeed back. But what if Voldemort just imperiouses someone to go there and steal it? Harry inquired at one Order meeting. He can't, Bill Weasley said brightly. A prophecy can only be withdrawn by those it is made about. In this case you and you know who. Since you're not going to get it, he'll have to do it himself. That did make sense, Harry supposed, but the plan would unfold too slowly for his tastes. Besides which, if I were Voldemort, I would try to make me, that is Harry Potter, get the prophecy for me. Then I wouldn't have to go to the Ministry. Sirius Black nodded, grimacing. There is that danger, yes, but you should be safe at Hogwarts. To date, Harry had been attacked at Hogwarts 4 or 5? Either way, if that counted as safe, Harry wasn't sure he wanted to know the Order's take on high-risk locations. And you can resist the Imperius, Tonks added, hair abruptly changing from pink to bright purple. That's the surest way you know who could have made you go after the prophecy, so... You know who could still kidnap the lad in Hogsmeade, torture him into insanity, and make him get the prophecy once his mind is broken? Moody barked, startling everyone. Constant vigilance! Tonks argued that Voldemort would hardly do something so rash if the whole point of the stealing the prophecy was to discover why he couldn't curse Harry properly. Kingsley Shacklebolt countered that Voldemort could delegate torturing Harry to the Death Eaters and avoid coming into contact with him. Bill reasoned that chickening out of meeting Harry would lose Voldemort credibility with his own followers. Mrs. Weasley requested that could they please stop discussing something so morbid as torturing Harry into insanity and move on to more productive matters like cleaning, perhaps? Oddly, whenever cleaning was brought up, everyone tended to suddenly recall 1,000 things they had to do just now, without delay, and thank you for the tea, but they will be going. Harry often evaded cleaning duty by sequestering himself in the library of the noble and most ancient House of Black. It had taken a while for people to figure out where he was disappearing to, and then he'd had a bit of a falling out with Sirius Black. He was rather vocal in his opinion that the House of Black was evil, and whatever books they had collected over centuries of evilness were better off burnt. Harry agreed that the Blacks had been sick bastards, but he was actually quite intrigued by the way they had lived and thought. He'd visited a traditional wizard household before, the Longbottom Manor, but this was his first time in a dark wizard's home, and he was treating it as a fascinating museum trip. The library, for one, was an absolute treasure trove of information. It was like Hogwarts' restricted section, wide open and free for perusal. A lot of the books were rather gruesome and temperamental. One of them had nearly bitten Harry's fingers off when he tried opening it without some arcane password, but Harry was learning loads of interesting spells. After all, hearing what the Order was up to in this war was very nice, but the best thing Harry could actually do with himself was to get stronger in preparation for the future. He tried to get people to help him train, but the Order had been firm. No magic during the holidays, and never mind that the Ministry could not detect it here. Or maybe it was Dumbledore who'd been firm. Harry wasn't sure, but after a certain point he'd stopped arguing. He'd smiled, nodded, promised to be a good boy, and then made sure not to practice where they could see. He was especially careful to keep dark magic under wraps. It was the norm among the Slytherins to dabble in dark magic, because it was foolish to ignore the weapons your enemies might use, but the Order didn't seem to uphold the same views. They were all about keeping things clean and legal, except for the part where they were, illegal vigilantes opposing the Ministry. Harry noticed the irony. They did not. That pretty much summed up the differences between them. Harry leaned back in his favourite library armchair and frowned, twirling his wand in his fingers. It was a pity that he could only try spells which caused external physical effects. He'd come across quite a few mind-altering curses he wouldn't mind learning. However, there was really very little point in casting, say, Comprimo, a curse that dampened your opponent's will to fight, on an inanimate object like a table. The table might become greatly depressed and give up all struggle, but Harry would never know. "Caillou!" A cushion folded in on itself, as if gradually divested of feathers, and the smell of burning filled the air. Then the cushion's exterior went up in purple flames. Harry cast an air-freshening charm and smiled. He was getting better at controlling the curse that burned objects from the inside. Cast on a human, this curse would be a lot more difficult to counter than a simple burning spell. Pouring water on one's skin would do nothing without the proper counter-curse. As had been said, the Blacks sure owned interesting books. "Massaro!" Harry was about to get up and test whether his spell had worked, when Tonks came through the door and stepped right into the enchanted spot. "Watcha, Harry! Molly needs you in the drawing room." "What the hell?" Her right foot was sinking through the floor where Harry had made it turn soft and swampy. Restraining a snicker, Harry undid his work. "Sorry." He tried to look contrite. Tonks snorted. "Don't try those puppy dog eyes on me. It's not gonna work. You do know that you're not supposed to do magic, right?" "I'm not?" Harry repeated, feigning shock. "Well, there's my quota of wisdom for the day." Tonks rolled her eyes. "I really ought to report you." "Next time I will." She wagged her finger threateningly. "No, really, you've got to, respect the law and all that rot. And I'm an aura, so that's my duty." Harry arranged his face into an expression of utmost solemnity. Screw it," Tonks said, waving a hand. "Now come, Molly wants to see you, and no, I won't pretend that I didn't find you. Honestly, some days I'm not sure who's a bad influence on whom, you on those Weasley twins, or they on you." It was with great regret that Harry parted with Tonks on the landing and walked into the drawing-room. Mrs. Weasley, the twins, Ron and Ginny were already there, busy disinfecting the curtains from doxies hiding between the folds. Harry ignored Ron, gave a brief nod to Ginny and a fake smile to Mrs. Weasley, and then came up to Fred and George. After an hour, Mrs. Weasley announced a break for lunch and left the room to make food, taking Ginny with her. Glad for her absence, Harry and the twins approached a cabinet full of curious objects. Ron threw a disgruntled look at them and stomped over to the window. He seemed perpetually peeved that the twins included Harry in their company the way they never did him. "What do you think it does?" George asked, peering at a silver snuff-box. "Oh, shit!" The snuff-box wriggled in his grasp and bit his hand, making him drop it onto the floor. Fred and Harry looked on in interest as George's hand developed a brown crust, glazing over. "Most illuminating," Fred declared, carefully taking the snuff-box by his robe and putting it into his pocket. "I think we should see whether it can do anything for our you-know-what." He winked at Harry. Soon after his arrival at the headquarters, Harry had made a deal with Fred and George. He'd give them his Triwizard winnings as a start-up, capital for their joke shop, in return for them giving priority status to his product orders and looking into developing a more serious line in addition to prank material. The twins had refused at first, saying that 1,000 galleons was too great a sum, and that they'd do favours for Harry anyway. Friends didn't have to pay friends. However, Harry had pointed out that they could be more useful to him if they had the capital to develop new products. Since their business deal, Fred and George had acquired a spring in their step, obviously enthusiastic about all the ingredients and experiments they could now afford. "Now, speaking of useful stuff, what do you think of doxy poison, dear brother?" Fred said, nudging George and pointing to a bucket full of immobilized pests. As the twins went to harvest some doxies, Harry turned back to the cabinet. He ignored a vial of something that looked a lot like blood, and avoided a spindly-legged silver instrument of unknown function. His attention was drawn by a golden locket with an ornate letter S on it that seemed vaguely familiar. Harry frowned and took the locket, twirling it between his fingers. It was quite heavy, a solid weight on his palm, and he couldn't help thinking that he'd seen it somewhere before. "Filthy boys touching family treasures!" Harry started, looking down. Creature, the annoying house elf, was glowering at him. "Creature will not let nasty half-blood boys steal from the House of Black." "You're really rude," You're a really rude elf, you know that. He does, and I'm sure he enjoys it, Sirius Black said, entering the drawing room. What have you got there, Harry? Nothing much. Black was watching him expectantly, so Harry showed him the locket. Just this. Do you know anything about it? Nope, first time I see it. Black looked it over, then tried to open it to no avail. Merlin knows what my charming relatives could be storing inside. I doubt it's anything we'd want. With a careless move, Black threw the locket into the trash pile. The locket hadn't even landed when the house elf gave a crazed screech and leaped after it. Everyone turned around to watch, stunned, as creatures sailed through the air and caught the golden locket. The elf then dashed to the floor, clutching the locket to his chest, and, in the doorway, collided right with Severus Snape's legs. Snape raised an eyebrow as the house elf wriggled by him, and then turned to glare at everyone gathered in the drawing-room. In defiance of the lovely summer day, he was as pale and disagreeable-looking as ever. "Potter, a word," he demanded, not bothering with greetings. "What about?" Black butted in immediately. Snape was clearly going to say something that would only worsen the situation, so Harry rushed to talk before the man had a chance to respond. "It's all right, Sirius," he said, plastering on a smile. "I don't mind." Black and Snape still managed to exchange a couple of insults before Snape and Harry had left the room, but at least they didn't succeed in dragging Harry into that spat. Harry Potter 1, immature adults 0. Once in the library, Snape whirled around. "The headmaster has asked me to inform you of the situation with your relatives," he said without preamble. Harry nodded, attentive. He'd been wondering about this for a while, but Dumbledore had put off giving him the answer. Harry was sure that the old man was doing all he could to somehow keep the wards over the Dursleys' house intact. "The wards require your aunt's consent to remain charged," Snape continued. "They relied upon her good will to let you stay. Since she is, as of recently, quite stripped of reason," Snape's lip curled unpleasantly, "she cannot give her approval. Theoretically, the wards could also rely on the consent of your cousin, since he is a blood relation, but he remains quite unconvinced. I am given to understand that your uncle is the one who negatively affects his decision." Yeah, Harry could imagine. So the wards broke then. "This is not a laughing matter, Potter," Snape hissed. "It should also be clear to you that we cannot let the Ministry discover this, for with your Muggle relatives refusing to take you in, and your magical guardian a convicted criminal on the run, you could become a ward of the Ministry. In the present situation, there are few scenarios less desirable." "The Dursleys wouldn't stop being my official guardians just because the wards fell," Harry countered, refusing to balk before Snape's glare. "I don't think the Ministry even knew about the wards, sir." Harry would rather eat his own dress robes than expect Dumbledore to spill such information. Snape sneered at him. "Naturally, the Ministry knew nothing. However, now that the wards have fallen, the house is no longer protected from wizards, and the home of the boy who lived is an obvious target." "So did the wards contain a notice-me-not element, sir?" Harry asked, curious. "A wizard-repellent one, as far as I am aware," Snape corrected him. "They contained a unique wizard-repellent element, perhaps because your mother was a Muggle-born, which is why the wards could be maintained by your Muggle aunt." "Sir, but how much of it was my mother's doing, and how much did Dumbledore—" "I'm not here to answer your idiotic questions until the end of time, Potter," Snape interrupted, scowling at Harry through a curtain of greasy hair. "What you need to know is that the headmaster has managed to convince your uncle to remain your legal guardian in name only, with the provision that he does not have to see you again." "Does this mean—" "Officially, nothing has changed. Your Muggle uncle has custody of you, and his home address is listed as yours on Ministry records. Unofficially, you will spend your holidays elsewhere." Harry nodded. "The headmaster has layered new walls onto your relative's house to protect them from wizards that can now find them. He has also asked me to inform you that your aunt has been transferred to a Muggle hospital, where she will be taken care of. Now, if you don't have any more questions—" Snape's look communicated that Harry had better have no questions. "I shall take my leave." "Why didn't the headmaster just obliviate them?" Harry bit on his lip as soon as the words burst out of him. Suggestions like this were blasphemous at the Order headquarters. Snape gave Harry a long, inscrutable look. "Obliviating your relatives would have been futile, as the wards relied upon sincere emotion. The headmaster could remove the memory of the Dementor attack, but he would not be able to generate enough goodwill in your relatives for long-term maintenance of the wards." "I see." Already by the door, Snape turned around. "Oh, and Potter, if you have been entertaining dreams of becoming the Slytherin prefect this year, give them up. Mr. Malfoy got the position." Once Snape departed with a final sneer, Harry did not return to the drawing-room to clean. Instead, he lowered himself back into his favourite armchair and took out his wand. He wasn't taking his irritation out on innocent cushions. It was called spell practice, damn it. The sidelong glances and excited whispers started already at platform 9 3/4. Harry had expected it, of course. It was inevitable with the way the previous school year had ended, and with all the slander in the Daily Prophet. The student population had to be curious, and curious was better than adamantly antagonistic, so Harry didn't let on that the scrutiny bothered him. He joked with the twins, who then went off to greet Lee Jordan. He withstood a very demonstrably flaunting help from Padma, and shook hands with Cedric. "Stop glaring at everyone," Harry muttered to Neville as they boarded the train. "Not all these people are against me," he hoped. "Hey, Harry!" Lavender Brown and Parvati chorused when he walked past their compartment. He smiled at them and ignored Seamus Finnegan's glower. In a compartment a little way ahead, Ernie Macmillan was arguing with Zacharias Smith about whether or not Harry could be trusted. Ernie was saying that if Cedric confirmed that Harry had been portkeyed away from the third task, it was probably true, and that they couldn't discount what had happened after the task. Smith insisted that Harry was definitely balmy, and had Ernie forgotten the way Harry the Glory Hound had stolen the spotlight from Hufflepuff last year? Terry and Anthony waved at Harry cheerily when he passed them by, and their friend Michael Corner nodded at him in greeting. The bunch of second-year Ravenclaws paled when they saw Harry, and shut their compartment door in fright. "Sorry, Harry," Hermione said, squeezing past him in a rush. "Oh, hi, Neville. I didn't see you on the platform. I meant to ride in the prefect's carriage. It's somewhere up ahead." "I know. Cedric is already there, I think," Harry said, as Neville stood aside to let Hermione pass. "You might want to wait up for Tony. He's the Ravenclaw fifth-year prefect this year." "Really?" Hermione beamed. "It's nice to have a familiar face there. I don't know who the other fifth-year Gryffindor prefect is yet." "It's Dean Thomas," Harry said. "Cedric's head boy. He's got the list. You should see Padma there too." Hermione didn't seem delighted at that last tidbit of information, but instead chose to vent her frustration with the fact that Malfoy and not Harry became the Slytherin prefect this year. "She's right," Neville said, once they'd sat down in an empty compartment. "You would have been a lot better than Malfoy. I wonder who decides these things." "Head of house?" Harry suggested. "Headmaster? I've no idea. I'm sure it was a political decision either way." "And a sad state of affairs it is when supporting Malfoy is a more politically sound decision than supporting you, Harry," Blaise said, entering together with Millie. "Hello, Longbottom. Can't say I've missed seeing you." "Likewise, I'm sure," Neville muttered. Millie frowned at Harry. "So, Potter, want to tell us what you've been so secretive about all summer?" "Yeah, just a moment. Luna, in here," Harry said, getting up and opening the door. "Hello, Harry," Luna said. Harry had forgotten quite how dreamy Luna's voice was. I wondered whether... I wonder when I'd be seeing you. People are talking about you, you know." "They're even writing about him in the newspapers," Blaise said seriously. "Quite famous, our Harry is." Neville moved over to let Luna sit next to him. "So," Millicent prodded, undeterred, "what did you do in the summer?" "Stayed at the headquarters of Dumbledore's Underground Club," Harry said, "and it wasn't half as grand as it sounds, so there's no need to make that face." "What was it like, then?" Neville asked. "And did you learn anything interesting?" Blaise added. Harry grimaced. "Not really. Dumbledore is mainly concerned with bringing Voldemort out into the open and recruiting allies, which is, well, pretty common sense." "Has he got a plan?" Neville inquired. Harry thought about the prophecy, the guards around the Department of Mysteries, the endless meetings, and Snape's spying. "Nothing to write home about," he said. Blaise snorted. "Figures. My mother has always believed that Dumbledore is not half as competent as he pretends to be." Neville glared at him. "Dumbledore is the most powerful wizard alive." "So what? He is still incompetent," Millie snapped. "Just look at who's he's been hiring for defense teachers. The school standards are declining every year." "Not to mention Binns," Blaise said. "It's criminal how little history we're actually learning. Criminal." "Well, I think his worst decision was hiring Snape to teach potions," Neville declared. "You're just saying that because you're a Gryffindor, and you just only like him because he favours Slytherins." "Dumbledore's beard is pretty," Luna said, interrupting the budding quarrel. When everyone quieted down to stare at her, she added, "Some things he does are very strange, though. I think he might be infected with Raxspurts." "Exactly," Blaise agreed. "Wait, what?" Dumbledore's staff hiring choices became a subject of discussion once again at dinner, after Dolores Umbridge, a toad thinly disguised as a human, stood up and randomly gave a supremely convoluted and deeply worrying introductory speech. "Dolores Umbridge," Nod said with a pensive air, "formerly the senior Undersecretary to the Minister. Should be interesting." "A bold career move," Harry noted lightly. Inside he was far from cheerful. From his speech it could be deduced that Umbridge had very strong support of the Ministry behind her, and Nod's oddly forthcoming comment shed light on just how powerful the woman was. In the current political atmosphere, with Dumbledore barely hanging on to bargaining power in the Ministry, her appearance at Hogwarts was more than a little sinister. "Umbridge is a friend of your father's, isn't she?" Nod continued, turning to Malfoy. Harry's eyebrows rose. It was uncharacteristic for Nod to part with valuable information so easily. Perhaps he and Malfoy had had a falling out. Malfoy threw Nod a derisive look. Of course, my father has friends in the higher echelons of the Ministry." Yep, they definitely had a fight. "And I'm going to enjoy watching you squirm, Potter," Malfoy said, turning to Harry. "You see, Madame Umbridge absolutely abhors attention-seeking liars." "I wonder how she's going to deal with you, then," Harry said. Malfoy's eyes narrowed. "Think you're funny, do you? Well, we'll see who has the last laugh." In retrospect, it was ironic that Harry had learned more while locked up in a creepy old house than he had in his actual defense against the dark arts lesson at Hogwarts. Under Umbridge's vigilant eye, fifth-year Slytherins read a mind-numbingly boring book and took notes, with Umbridge promising sweetly that they had nothing to fear in her class, since they would be practicing no actual magic. She stalked between students' desks, eyes alert for possible miscreants, and exuded an aura of such self-satisfaction that Harry felt the surging desire to throttle her. She took special notice of Harry, too, apart from insinuating, not very subtly, that there was a misguided person in the class who'd been telling them awful lies. She gazed at Harry in a way that suggested that she was waiting for him to slip up and give her an excuse to do something horrible. Harry resolved not to give her the chance and refrained from making disrespectful comments. Harry had expected that Umbridge would try to discredit him before the school population. Umbridge's refusal to teach them any spells came as an unanticipated blow. The Slytherin class had been quiet and watchful. They had gone along with Umbridge's lesson plan without a protest. Harry resolved to ask his friends from other houses how their defense lessons had gone. Maybe someone else, the brave Gryffindors, for example, had actually asked the professor about using magic. Turned out Hermione had. "There won't be a need to practice these spells," she said, mocking Umbridge's condescending tone. "Theoretical understanding will adequately prepare you for your owl exam. There is nothing dangerous waiting for you in the outside world." "Yes, and you know who doesn't count," Neville agreed. Ron Weasley asked. Umbridge had fuck-awful timing. Harry couldn't afford to waste a whole year of defense. Voldemort was out there, even if he wasn't yet moving openly, and Harry knew that they would meet again. It wasn't a question of if, but of when. And Harry needed to be better prepared than he'd been the last time, and preparing was the only thing he could do in the war at this point, and he couldn't do even that if he didn't get to learn. "Yes, but Harry, didn't you train last year anyway?" Padma said when they went to the library after the arithmancy class to work on their assignments. "You were always busy studying for the tournament." Padma pursed her lips, perhaps remembering their failed romance that took place during that time. "Surely you could organize something like this again." Harry snorted. "A lot of things have changed since last year. The guys who trained me then are more likely to ambush me now." That was a slight exaggeration. There were indeed numerous Slytherins who would probably try to strangle Harry in his sleep if Voldemort told them to, but so far Harry had been met with no violence. Or, well, no more violence than was normal for Slytherin, and Ministry propaganda or no, not many people dared to really push a Triwizard winner who defeated Voldemort as a baby and was immune to the killing curse, if rumours were to be believed. The idea of getting extracurricular training stayed with Harry, though, perhaps because he'd been so used to it from last year, it almost felt like something was missing from his life without those training hours, despite how busy he already was with his owl coursework and Quidditch practices. A couple of weeks into the school year, he brought it up with Cedric, to see how it would fly. "You want me to train you," Cedric said dubiously. "I don't think that I'm against it or anything, but I think it's a little silly, considering that it was you, not me, who won the Triwizard Tournament in the end." Harry rolled his eyes. "You know how I won. I've told you about Barty Crouch Jr. paving the way for me." "That's bullshit, Harry," Cedric said, frowning. "That is, it's true that I probably know more magic than you, considering that I'm 2 school years ahead, but it would be a lie to say that you weren't at all responsible for your win. Barty Crouch didn't do the first task for you, nor the third, and we've had our disagreements, but you did win in an even duel between us. Uneven, actually, since you were injured. Said, I could agree to us training together, though. Perhaps with a few other people. It's not just you who's falling behind this year. We're all upset about Umbridge." "You're suggesting a dueling club of sorts?" "Yes," Cedric nodded. "Would it be such a bad idea?" Harry took a few days to think about it, but the more he thought, the more he liked it. It wasn't only the opportunity to practice defense that appealed to him, but also the chance to reach out to a wider school population. He couldn't climb onto the table during dinner and declare himself innocent against all of Umbridge's accusations. He did not dare speak against her publicly at all for fear of retaliation. Once she'd become the High Inquisitor, he also gave up on the idea of contacting Rita Skeeter. While he might sway a part of the public that way, he would also have to suffer severe consequences. His support base was just not wide enough for risky moves such as those. However, an underground effort? That could work. That was worth trying. 2 weeks after his conversation with Cedric, Harry stood in front of a crowd of 20-odd people in the hidden room, preparing to give his first ever speech. A lot of the people he knew, some he didn't. Quite a few were older, like Cedric's Hufflepuff friends and the twins' Gryffindor buddies. Ginny Weasley and Colin Creevey were the youngest, though they might soon be beaten by Astoria Greengrass if she'd followed Daphne in. Harry had a feeling that people would continue trickling in. The idea of defense practice seemed to be a popular one, or maybe it was the allure of defying Umbridge. Harry had done his best to observe the woman since his dispiriting first lesson with her, and quickly found that her weakest point was her absolute belief that ministry power could accomplish everything. Umbridge envisaged herself to be the most influential being on the planet, bar the minister himself, simply because she enjoyed strong ministry endorsement. While it was true that ministry backing made her a very dangerous adversary, Umbridge tended to rely on that power too much and disregard people's feelings. She alienated teachers without a second thought. She was condescending to students. Filch was the only being in Hogwarts, of those alive or dead, who wholeheartedly approved of her. Even people who openly supported Umbridge's policies could not justify her refusal to teach them defence. Harry had particularly enjoyed putting Malfoy on the spot for that one. Nobody rebelled openly, of course, but it was early days yet. The school's silence was born out of caution, not of genuine support for Umbridge. Harry was doing his best to capitalize on that. "Good evening to you all," he said, projecting a aplomb that he did not feel. "Introductions aren't necessary, seeing as we all know why we're here, but I suppose a few inspirational statements won't hurt, so do me a favour and listen up." Blaise shook his head. Cedric smiled encouragingly from where he stood amid other Hufflepuffs. Hermione looked ready to take notes. "So, we're all here because we believe that Umbridge is doing a stellar job of bollocksing up our defence classes. Sitting on our asses and reading useless books does not sound like a productive way to go about learning spells to me, and clearly to you neither." "Hear, hear," the Weasley twins chorused. "Therefore, it's high time we took matters into our own hands and taught ourselves what we are being denied in class," Harry continued. "This is why we are holding the first meeting of the Duelling Club." "Which will hopefully sell better than Lockhart's Duelling Club did," Fred added. People around the room snickered. Harry smiled. "One would hope so, yes," he agreed. "Now, more importantly, I believe we've come here not only because Umbridge is teaching us absolutely nothing and can potentially jeopardize our exam results. We are also angry at the way Umbridge has taken over the school. Umbridge is not here to teach us. She is here to spy on us and sabotage Hogwarts. She will only get as far as we let her. I say, let's amass strength and drive the bitch out." People were watching him as though spellbound. Even Padma and Parvati had stopped gossiping and were looking at him with wide eyes. Hell, Blaise was listening. When Harry made a pause, the crowd suddenly burst into applause, complete with whistles and appreciative comments. "Thank you," Harry went on, once it died down. "Now, let's just run through a few technical details before we start practicing. The Duelling Club is not illegal according to Umbridge yet," he said, looking over to the congregated students and willing the next message to sink in. "She's just become the High Inquisitor, so she might very well outlaw practicing defence out of class. I don't know, but I don't want to find out. The bottom line is, don't get caught," Harry said emphatically. "Don't mention this club to people you don't trust. Don't talk about it where you might be overheard, and try not to be overt when you're going for a meeting." Harry seriously hoped that people understood the need for secrecy, because so far they did not have any security arrangements. Hermione had suggested cursed parchment, but that would only be effective after they'd been betrayed, and would do nothing to prevent a leak. Blaise had mentioned that his mother used some sort of a parchment that bound people to silence. He'd promised to look into that. "You'll be informed of the dates for future meetings through the club's grapevine. All of us here have friends in common. It would of course be easier to set aside a certain night every week, but we have to allow for the Quidditch practices of all house teams and prefect meetings for those who have them." Harry was proud to say that they had collected a decent number of prefects here actually. Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff, Padma and Anthony from Ravenclaw, Dean Thomas and Hermione from Gryffindor, a few sixth years too. Not to mention the fact that the head boy was in attendance. It paid to be well connected. "If you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to ask. And let's finally start on some spells. Can everyone here do a stunner?" Harry had discussed the lesson plans with Cedric prior to this meeting. They'd figured they'd better start from simple but necessary spells, and those who knew how to do them could help those who didn't. Harry expected that he would be quite ahead of his classmates due to having learned a lot of spells last year, and even more in the Black Library this summer. Besides, defense, in addition to potions, was a subject he'd consistently studied ahead for by virtue of necessity. He'd had to defend himself ever since first year. Following Harry's orders, people dispersed through the room to practice in pairs, and instructors started walking among them, helping out. "Wow, Harry," Padma said, coming up to him. "You look quite dashing when you go all authoritative, did you know? Now, will anyone tell me how the stunning spell actually works? Of course, I know the incantation, but that doesn't mean I can cast it right." "I'll show you," Cedric offered. Cho materialized by Cedric's side and requested to be shown the spell too. Harry smiled at them and walked over to correct Susan Bones's pronunciation. "Thanks, Harry," she said, smiling. "I think I'll get it now. Stupefy!" Harry blocked automatically as a red beam of light flew at him. Susan laughed in glee when she did. Cute dimples formed on her cheeks. "You're quite welcome," Harry said, blinking. Maybe it was just him or the lighting, but suddenly a girl he used to pass by in the corridors without a second glance looked really pretty. Not breathtakingly beautiful like Fleur, or quite as obviously attractive as Padma and Parvati, but there was just something appealing about her. The classical features of her face, combined with the braid she always wore and the pearl earrings, made Harry think of girls on old oil paintings he'd seen around Hogwarts. How very bizarre. With a mumbled goodbye, Harry went over to help Terry, Anthony, and their friend Michael corner, and then Neville and Hermione waved him over. He was glad he wasn't the only one who knew how to do the spell, because he couldn't imagine trying to instruct everyone at once. And it was sort of creepy, the way these kids kept turning to him for advice, as if he wasn't a student just like them. "Thanks for giving me a chance to be here," Dean Thomas said awkwardly, when Harry stopped by to correct his wand movements. Harry glanced at him. "Neville recommended you," he shrugged. "Besides, you seem like a decent bloke, from what I've seen at Quidditch. And a prefect, besides." Dean nodded. Luna, who was his partner, seemed to lose interest in the conversation, and instead turned to watch as Mandy Brocklehurst accused Harry of being a chauvinistic male pig. "Neville also said that you wouldn't spill things to Weasley and Finnegan at the first opportunity," Harry continued, cocking his head to the side, and he knew that Dean had not missed the warning in his voice. "Do you think, eventually—" "I'm not rejecting anyone," Harry said pleasantly. "Weasley just needs to acknowledge that he's been a dick to me for no good reason ever since first year. She'd also apologized to me for it. And he needs to get over the Gryffindor jingoism, though that might be asking too much." Harry smiled wryly. "I find it pretty pointless if I teach someone to fight and then they turn against me." "Yeah, I get it. You're right. He's just—" Dean floundered for an explanation. "Never mind. I'll work on him." "All right," Harry said. "Just don't be too obvious about the club. And good job on that stunner. I think you're getting it soon." "Soon," as in like after a lot of practice. Harry frowned as he approached Tracy and Daphne, who were finding new and exciting ways to butcher the incantation. It was ridiculous that so many fifth years, and even some of the older kids, were unable to do an elementary stunning spell. Maybe starting up the dueling club was an even better idea than Harry had initially thought. Such a level of incompetence was untenable with the threat of Voldemort looming above them all.